the genesis of this was that, I guess about two and a half years ago, Beth and I sat down to talk about where we saw things moving with AETE. And one of the things that we realized was that there had never been any attempt to try to determine or to generate any data to show how effective AETE may have been in terms of accomplishing its goal of bringing evangelism to a place at the table in theological education, which is how we got our name, right? An Academy for Evangelism in Theological Education. And we shouldn't take that for granted, the idea that evangelism didn't have a spot that was universally accepted in theological education originally. So, one of the things that we can look at here is that, just a brief look back, AETE was founded in 1973, we've already heard about that, and the journal was then established later in 1985. In doing that, the goal was to provide a place for scholarly discussion and engagement among those who were focusing on evangelism. And that was needed for at least 3 reasons. And this is broad. I know that there's more that can be said about it. But one is that evangelism was not respected as an academic discipline. In fact, to this day, I've had conversations with people, even folks who I like and who I know and I trust, right, who will pull me to the side and say, well, you don't really teach an academic discipline, right? I mean, that's the way it is. So this was even worse back then, right? Evangelism was seen as a bailiwick of a very few people and specialized and mostly practitioners. So if you think about 1973, this is when you have Billy Graham in his heyday, when you have Catherine Kuhlman that is on television, Oral Roberts is holding his big events. You've got this kind of picture of what evangelism looks like, and it's this specialized group of practitioners that seems like it belongs much more to popular culture than it belongs to anything that's scholarly. And then finally, you have the WCC and Lausanne split. And that polarized the church and was really codified in 1974 with Lausanne Covenant that gets adopted. But this is polarizing the church as to what does evangelism really mean. And so there's a notion that on the one hand you have the evangelicals saying evangelism is verbal proclamation only, and then you've got the mainline and broadly more conciliar churches that are arguing, well, we want to sort of make room for mission in a very broad way, and the language of evangelism sort of slowly slips and changes over time. And we heard how some of that played out in the Southern Baptist Church from Hal and Ron yesterday. So all this is going on, but all of it is making evangelism seem like it's a much tinier target to try to focus on, and not something that's really appropriate to a sort of liberal, open academy, right, in the broader sense of scholarship. So AETE is formed in the midst of this when there's a desire to try to make evangelism something that has academic teeth to it. So what's been the impact? That's what we hadn't really known. AETE is formed. We know that just anecdotally, the impact is that it's helped to generate scholars of evangelism and multiple generations of that, right? So Hal pointed out yesterday that there are 3 generations that we at least know of at this point, that David Lowes Watson was part of Generation 1, and that Hal and Ron are part of Generation 2, and we're all part of Generation 3. And there's a Generation 4, God willing, coming along after that. So to what extent have those of us who have been part of AETE been affected, and how has it affected where we're doing our teaching? So that's what this study was set up to figure out. And so what I did is send out a questionnaire to all past and present members, and even a few friends of AETE, people who I had contacts for, who had at least visited with us once or twice along the way. And I asked them a whole series of questions. Many of you probably got this questionnaire, had a chance to fill it out, so you know it wasn't short. It was a sizable questionnaire. But there were 2 broad parts to it. The first was to ask the people who responded about their work, just to get a sense for who are we as a sort of professional tribe, those of us who teach evangelism, and then what was the response of, what was the respondents' view of how the work they were doing was accepted in their school, right? So, bearing in mind, a lot of this is their own self-reflection. So it's not scored up against some absolute value. This is their own personal sense of how well they're being received and their work is being received. Of all of it, we got a 20% return rate, which I think wasn't too bad. That was 27 people overall, and as you'll see, it was actually well distributed in terms of the kinds of schools that they were a part of. So you'll get a chance to see that here shortly. So let's talk about the respondents, who they are. All right, so first of all, of the respondents, and this is just the way that they've described themselves, slightly more than half have the word evangelism in their job title. So I think that's important, that slightly more than half of the respondents are identified explicitly as someone that teaches or engages with evangelism. So that's, you can't get away from it. And I don't know, if those of you who have it in your job title, I don't know if you have the same experience that I do, which is when somebody on the plane says, "What do you do?" And you answer them. Oftentimes, the newspaper comes up, the Kindle gets switched on, or whatever happens to try to avoid eye contact for the rest of the flight. Right? So, because it means something. There's a lightning rod when the word evangelism is in your job title. So we've got about half of us that have that. Slightly less than half have held their position for 8+ years. So we're a fairly long-lived group in the sense that we've been in our jobs for a while. And I think that that's helpful to know of the respondents, that there's a lot of experience that's behind this. Slightly less than half were either tenured or tenure track. This is interesting to me because it suggests that tenure, or that the option of tenure, is not available to at least half the people that are out there that were responding. Now that may be because some of them are teaching in terms of adjunct work. It may be there are a lot of questions that could be asked beyond what my initial question, so you'll see that part of this is suggestive of new work. But tenure is not an option for everybody that teaches evangelism. It hasn't reached the level of a tenure position for everyone. Of the 27, 3 were retirees, 2 of whom had held their positions for over 20 years. Right? So we had a few retirees that answered, and they had been in those positions for a long time. So part of that earlier generation of scholars that had come through. So this was one of the follow-up questions. How many are actually regular faculty? I didn't ask that, and that might be something that would be helpful to ask. Partly because it would let us know if schools are using regular faculty or they're adjuncting out what classes they have available on evangelism. So here are some other things about what I learned about the folks who teach evangelism. First of all, we're a multidisciplinary bunch. We don't just teach evangelism. So just over half, right, teach one evangelism course per year. Just under half teach 2 to 3. So depending on where we are, we may be teaching one evangelism or we may be teaching far more than that in terms of those courses. 65% are taught online. I don't know about you, but when I first started teaching, one of the things I was told unequivocally is that it is impossible to teach practical theology online. If there's anything I've learned from evangelism and its professors is that we sort of sneer at the conventional wisdom of pedagogy. We don't just bow to it. In fact, we figure out ways around it. So more than half of us are teaching our courses online. Virtually everyone teaches courses in other disciplines. So it's not just that we're teaching our evangelism courses. Almost every respondent said that he or she was also teaching in another course. And so the courses can be some things that are fairly obvious, like missions, that's sort of an easy cognate, cultural studies, but then also theology, denominational studies, history, discipleship or spiritual formation, practical theology, leadership, world religions, pastoral ministry, church planting, New Testament, and Christian ethics. People are teaching in all of these other areas. And that says something, that by and large, we're a multidisciplinary group. We don't just teach evangelism. We're generalists in practical theology, many of us, and probably slot into multiple places on the faculty. I think that says something about our utility at theological schools. That when a school is looking to hire an evangelism professor, the school's probably not just looking for someone who knows evangelism. They're looking for someone who can do evangelism plus. And by and large, we've risen to that challenge. It's interesting that of the courses we teach, that I asked about attendance, and we found that those who teach, that of these courses, the evangelism courses are slightly better attended than the other courses that professors teach. Not only are we multidisciplinary in our teaching, but we multitask. By that I mean that about 2/3 of us have formal administrative positions in addition to the teaching that we do. Right? So we're not just teaching, we're also running degree programs, we're also overseeing or directing various kinds of centers and studies and other pieces that go along with what we're doing, with just running the day-to-day aspects of the school. Beyond the work with our schools, about half of us also consult locally or denominationally with church leaders a few times a year. 30% said it's about once a month that they're consulting or working with the larger church. And 1/3 hold paid or volunteer positions in the church or in their communities. So this is a lot of work we're doing, just to bear in mind. And for some of the people, they were doing all of these things. It wasn't just, a smattering here and there. So you've got some folks who are teaching in multiple disciplines. They're holding an administrative job down in the church or in the school. They're helping out with the larger church, and they may actually be paid or volunteering in their local church as well. I think we need to stop and sort of take that in as to what we're doing. What this suggests to me is that those of us who teach evangelism understand that our primary work isn't just to move scholarship forward. Now please understand, I'm not suggesting that this means that we believe in shoddy scholarship or we're just slapping things together. But it suggests that we are actually pretty good about practicing what we preach. We're not just out there writing theoretically about how do people engage with Jesus Christ. We're actually engaged in seeing whether or not our stuff works by going and connecting with the local church or the denominational church or wherever it might be. And we're working with students in a way that allows us to build relationships outside of the classroom as administrators. I think this is sort of a critical piece to understand. And one of the things I hope that this study will do is to provide an interpretive lens that we can carry back to our schools, so that when they're searching for an evangelism professor or when they're going through a promotion procedure, they'll be able to say, this is kind of what you see in a good evangelism professor. And not necessarily, I know some schools, the tendency is to say to get tenure or to get promoted, you have to meet this sort of arbitrary requirement that's the same requirement that somebody who's teaching in the medical field or teaching in law or teaching in history, has to meet. And one of the things I want to suggest is that we've got a different audience. We've got other scholars, but we also have the people in the church that we're trying to reach and touch. And in fact, we live out our calling by doing these things. We're actively out and engaged with it. I don't have studies on how this compares to other fields, but I'd be willing to bet that we have a much higher percentage of our folks out doing these things than in other fields. So, again, I'm impressed by it, and I think that this is a helpful piece to know. Now, speaking to the idea of having an audience beyond that's in the church and out in the larger world, not just in the academy, where we really begin to see that break down is in terms of publishing and presentations. So I don't know if you can see these. This, by the way, is being published in the journal. I blind submitted it to Jeff, and it got reviewed, and so I'm grateful. It's going to be, it was peer reviewed and it's accepted. So you'll be able to read the long form of this in the journal when it comes out next month. But one of the things that we found here is that when I asked how many peer-reviewed articles have you published and how many non-academic items have you published, what you'll notice is that this purple area, that means 21 plus, along in here, these are the higher numbers, there's a reasonable number of peer-reviewed articles that have been published, but it's not huge. Most people fall into this 38, a little over a third of the people fall into the 0 to 3 category. However, when you jump down to the non-academic articles, if you look at this, 1/4 of the people have over 21 articles that are in non-academic publications of some sort or another. So a much larger number of people, almost no one in the 0 to 3. I point this out to say that it's clear that when evangelism professors publish, we publish much more heavily in church-related or general interest publications. And so church magazines, etc., as opposed to in peer-reviewed journals. Now, partly that may be because peer-reviewed journals take longer to get through, right? I mean, they need to be reviewed and the like. Partly, it may be there aren't enough peer-reviewed journals that are interested in evangelism for us to publish in. I don't know about you, but I know that I find myself going back to the same well over and over again, and at some point I feel like I probably should take a couple of years off of sending something to these people because they're probably sick of seeing my articles over and over again. Part of it is that I think we're really interested in publishing for the church. And so when we're looking at what we're writing, most of the time we're choosing to write for the larger church audience, not for the academic audience. Not that we don't do that, we clearly do, but we spend an awful lot of time writing for the local church. And I think that's critical to understand. So it suggests maybe we need to beef up a little bit more how many peer-reviewed opportunities there are for us. So Jeff is going to be working on that, right? And we've got more opportunities in Witness. And looking for that, but it also suggests that we really do have an audience in the larger church. And we should own that. I don't think that's something we should be ashamed of or we should sort of soft pedal, but own the fact that we're working and doing scholarship that we want the non-specialists to be able to understand and accept and receive. Our presentations follow the same pattern. How many times have you presented at an academic conference? You'll notice, again, the purple is the big one. So a lot of people have presented, right? And how many times at non-academic conferences? So here, nobody's in the dark purple at the academic conference. Most people are in the 0 to 3 category with academic. In the non-academic conferences, look, 40% are at 21 plus at non-academic conferences, which would include church conferences and the like. Again, it's not that we don't believe in presenting at academic conferences. I'm a believer in it, personally. But so we do that, but where we really put our time and effort is in reaching out to make sure that our scholarship is effective and accessible and meaningful to the local church or denominational church, whatever level we may be at. So again, the publishing, the presenting just jumped out to me as I was going through these statistics and from the respondents. We spend our time making sure that the work we do isn't just for the academy, it's also for those that are going to use it out in the world. And more than that, because we multitask, we're part of those people who are out there using it. We're not just developing it and then letting it go. We're out testing it and we're engaging with people in the church and in the larger world as well. Once more, I just think this is something we should own as evangelism professors. We are scholar practitioners. The whole notion that those two things are separated is antiquated, and it's not how we operate. We don't live that way. I don't know if you've had this experience. I've been invited to church events, and they say, oh, we wanted some scholars to go along with the practitioners, as if scholars never practice anything, and practitioners never think, right? And that, in fact, is not how it works. And we're the example of that. We do both of those things and bring that together. So that's what the data is saying. So that's the data that we've got in reference to who we are as evangelism professors. So that said, how well are we and is our teaching received in the schools where we are? That's what the next set of data will look at. So one of the things I did that I thought would be helpful to control for in looking at this data is considering where the schools, and again, this is self-reported, so it's not held up against any particular sort of orthodoxy that people had to rate themselves based off of, but was to have the respondents self-report as to how conservative or liberal they thought their school was theologically. So a 1 was as far liberal as you could get, a 5 was as far conservative. You'll notice we actually had almost a perfect bell curve, which was nice to have it shake out that way. So there was 1 respondent that rated the school where this respondent was as far liberal, 1 that rated the school where the respondent was as far conservative, and then sort of a shakeout in between. It's a lot of people considering themselves moderate. So what I did is simply break out anything that was a 1 or a 2, I call liberal. Going forward, anything that was a 4 or 5, I call conservative. Anything 3, I call moderate. And that's how I rank that. One thing that I thought was really interesting, just because I happen to know the schools, all the schools that were ranked as liberal are United Methodist. It's just something to throw out there. There were a couple of United Methodists that worked in here, but there aren't any in these 6 schools here that were not United Methodist. So just something for those of us who are United Methodists to bear in mind. That's how we see ourselves. I asked about the extent to which the teaching that was done, the evangelism courses that were being offered, were required either in a degree or for a concentration within a degree, or by the denomination that a group might be related to, that a school was related to. So 38.5% have a degree or concentration within a degree devoted to evangelism. So that was higher than I thought. A little over a third of our schools actually have a degree or a concentration within a larger degree where evangelism is a requirement. And this is for graduation only here. 52% require a course in evangelism to graduate. So they may not have a specialized degree or a specialized concentration, but you don't get out of that degree unless you've taken at least 1 course. That's about half of our schools, which again was higher than I thought it would be. Curious, all but 1 of these schools were moderate or conservative. So this is not something the liberal schools do. This is something that moderate and conservative schools will set up either the degrees, the concentrations, or the requirement. That said, that in terms of denominational requirement, all of the United Methodist Church was the only church that was reported, at least in this, that required evangelism for ordination. And so even though the schools related to the United Methodist Church did not have a course in evangelism required for their degree to graduate, they did have the course required for ordination for the church. So it's interesting that the kind of onus on taking it was for those that wanted to get ordained, not necessarily those that wanted to graduate, right? So it's a kind of interesting dynamic that you've got there. It's also interesting to note that the United Methodist schools have help from an outside organization. They're the ones that consistently, there's the Foundation for Evangelism, and the foundation is the one that is funding the professorships in evangelism, the E. Stanley Jones professorships that you've heard us talking about. So there's this strange dynamic here that you've got, where the liberal United Methodist schools don't require evangelism for their degrees, but they have the strongest denominational support, including outside resources, to make sure evangelism gets taught. Whereas the conservative and moderate schools require it, but don't have that backing. So it's a kind of really curious thing that's going on here, as if the liberal schools only do it because there's money flowing in to help them get it done, and a denominational requirement. The moderate schools will do it anyway. So it's a kind of curious thing, and you'll see this split between the liberal and the conservative schools will actually grow a bit more as I show more of this data. So integration, I kept that same 1 to 5 Likert scale, and I asked about the extent to which the respondents felt like evangelism is integrated into their curriculum as a field of study. So to what extent is evangelism accepted in their field of study? Liberal schools said 3, so right down the middle. They said it's about partway there. Moderates a little more. Curiously, conservatives a little less, even than the liberals. This one surprised me. I sort of cast around, and I don't know that I have a good answer for this when I looked at the rest of the data to make sense of it. What I'm guessing, and I've got it down here, is that because the rest of the data will show that it seems like moderate and conservative schools are more welcoming to evangelism as a field of study. My guess here is that conservative schools have the debate going on that Ron and Hal pointed to, which is that the evangelism professors who are out actually trying to test all this stuff in real life are developing probably a slightly wider view of evangelism than the more conservative folks in the school are willing to accept. And so my hunch is, what you're dealing with here is a battle of definition of evangelism. That you've got a very conservative administration in these schools that's saying it's not evangelism if it's not verbal proclamation, but you've got the evangelism professors that are actually suggesting maybe there's more to it than just that, right? So the kind of personal and prophetic that David Lewis Watson was talking about yesterday, which may wrangle some of the folks that are in the more conservative schools. So just an interesting piece on this. That said, the conservative moderate schools, by and large, their respondents saw themselves in being much more fully embraced by their schools. So curriculum integration, faculty and administration. The question I asked here is, are other faculty and our administrators either familiar with what you teach in your evangelism course, and do they value your teaching in that evangelism course? Same 1 to 5. 1 being very little, that they're familiar with it or that they value it. 5, that they very much value it or understand it. Notice that this breakdown here, again, follows the liberal, moderate, conservative split that I was showing. In terms of familiar with are other faculty familiar with your teaching? In the liberal schools, the answer was pretty much no. It was a 2.2 out of 5. Do the other faculty value your teaching? I got the sense that this was answered with a shrug of the shoulders. Kind of like, yeah, I mean, they kind of like me, sort of thing. It wasn't that they necessarily value it, but they're not like actively hostile. So, we'll just kind of leave it at like, it's okay. Do your administrators understand it? Liberals, 2.6. So not much of a sense that the deans or the presidents or other administrators understood what the evangelism professors were teaching. Did they value you? 4. Here's my guess. Mainline denominational schools are struggling right now. That may be news to some of you, but it's happening. And what I think is going on, if you tie this back to the multitasking, multidisciplinary piece, I bet you've got a bunch of deans that are like, I need to hold on to this evangelism guy or gal because they're teaching evangelism plus all these other courses, and they're doing administrative work for me, so I value that person highly, right? I don't know if I know much about what they're teaching, right? But I value them highly because they're plugging a lot of holes for me. So I suspect that that's why you see that. You'll notice that these numbers are pretty similar for the moderate and for the conservative. Both of them argue that other faculty are, kind of familiar with what they're teaching. Not real high, but kind of familiar. And they both see themselves, actually moderate not quite as highly, but see themselves as valued. by other faculty. And then with administrators, both felt like administrators knew what they were doing by and large, and both felt highly valued by their administrators. Again, I suspect that's because of the multitasking, multidisciplinary piece that goes along with it. Curriculum integration. To what extent do we feel like the actual course itself is of evangelism, the evangelism courses, are integrated into how the overall curriculum is taught? So liberals, not much. This is, again, from 1 to 5, only 2.3. This was based off of this is curriculum integration, particularly how many students wanted to take the course. Most in the liberal school said they start not wanting to take it. They're just open about not wanting to take it. In the conservative and moderate, they're not thrilled with taking it, but they're, at least like slightly warm to it. On the back end, notice, all of them are very high. How many students valued taking the course? They valued the teaching that they receive. All really high. My guess, again here with the liberal, is that these students were so against it initially that the faculty, having sort of figured out how to negotiate that difficulty, amazed their students with the fact that they came out of the class without feeling like they were some kind of, evil charlatan that was going to bludgeon people with a Bible on the street corners. They were just really pleased that things had come out of it well. And so students had a much happier result and were sort of converted, as it were, because the class went so well. It also went well for the others. It's just striking how much better it went for the liberals. And I think it's because they had to overcome such a big initial block for them being a part of it. A few other items. This is going sort of looking forward to that next generation, the fourth generation. I asked how many would encourage students to teach evangelism. So how many of you would want to procreate, have another one that came along and taught after you? 89% of us said we would. So by and large, we pretty much are committed to the field of evangelism, and we want good new scholars coming along to keep that work up. How many of us thought it would be easy to find someone that would be good to do that work, either temporarily, so if we're out on sabbatical, or permanently, if we retired and someone was going to take our space? How many of us felt like our school could find a good replacement for us in that space of time? Notice this falls straight down based off of theological spectrum here. Liberals 2.8, moderates 3.1, and conservatives 3.5. So the more conservative the school, the more likely they were to think that they would be able to find a good replacement, either temporarily or permanently. One thing to notice is that when I was looking at the data, this clearly also broke down by size of school. The bigger schools, the universities, those respondents also happen to be more positive in this direction than others. So I'm not sure this is entirely theological. Part of it may just be the economics of higher education. We know we're a bigger school. We know we're going to have more people interested in teaching for us, and so we'll probably be able to find someone better. One thing that I'll bring up here, and this actually goes back to Rick Richardson, something that he has talked about. He's one of the past presidents, I guess 2 presidents ago. And Rick has done a lot of work around, he's the evangelism professor at Wheaton College. Rick did a lot of work around lead pastors and evangelism. And one of the things he asked lead pastors is, are you evangelizing people one-on-one? Not just through your church, but when you're out at the 7-Eleven or wherever yourself, are you talking to people about Jesus? And a lot of them weren't. And so he began working with them on that because he showed that as the lead pastor goes, so the rest of the congregation tends to go. So I thought it would be interesting to see how many of us who teach evangelism actually are out evangelizing, talking to people about Jesus. And so I asked, what extent do you engage in personal evangelism on a monthly basis? And from 1 being least frequently, 5 being all the time, at least every month, at least once a month. And you'll notice we don't rate so well on this, right? That by and large, we've got some folks that are doing it regularly, but a lot of us are in the virtually not at all category. And so I think that's something that we need to take into account, that this is part of our calling. We're good about being out in the church, helping the church itself to be better prepared to evangelize. In our multitasking, in our working in the local churches, in our working with denominations, we're good about that. We're good about helping the students overcome their initial resistance to evangelism and feeling good about having learned evangelism. What we're not as strong at is actually being out evangelizing ourselves. And I think that's interesting because we all know well enough that evangelism doesn't have to fit a particular personality style. It doesn't have to fit a particular mode or formula in order for it to be legitimate. But it's something that it seems like we're not as frequently doing. And so that I would simply lay out there as a point of consideration, that it seems to me that this is the one place where practicing what we preach may not be aligning quite as well as we would want it to be. So some conclusions on this. First of all, my big conclusion up here is that AETE and the journal have worked. That by and large it's worked. That from the strong distaste for evangelism back in the 1970s as a field of study, we have largely overcome that. That there is a solid foundation for evangelism in the academy broadly, and it's on a positive trajectory. We're moving in a positive way. Even if there's resistance by our students every semester when they come in, they're leaving in a positive sense, right? Even if our other faculty members and our administrators don't quite understand what we're doing, right? On the other hand, they like us, right? And they value us. And so we're not seen as that sort of dangerous person that's going to get in the way. We're seen as a valuable part of the entire faculty and of being, they want us engaged with the larger curriculum. Evangelism professors are more valued than evangelism itself as an academic discipline, right? I think that's another big conclusion I drew, largely because we're liked. We're out there doing all these multidisciplinary and multitasking things, so people like us, they're still not quite sure what we're doing, right? So there's a high level of ignorance about it, and it's more pronounced in liberal schools. And that's something that I think we need to own and to recognize, is that those of us who serve in more liberal schools probably are going to need a little more support, right? And that's something that we can do as an academy. We can reach out to the folks and just say, how are you doing? Make sure that they don't feel like they're too alone, particularly at the beginning of the semester when they're dealing with all the skepticism that initially hits them, is just to give them a sense of a little bit more support moving through. Because clearly there's a stronger initial hump that those folks need to get through every academic year. So recommendations. I think a couple of things. One, as I've already said, use this study as the basis for interpreting the work of evangelism scholars to the schools where we are. So this is going to be published, and I think this is important. So if your school is looking to hire someone in evangelism, I think this kind of scholarship is going to be helpful. This data is helpful because it helps interpret, this is what a good evangelism scholar ought to do. This is what a professor of evangelism looks like. Somebody who is multidisciplinary, who is multitasking, but who also cares heavily about the local church and is going to be spending less time trying to run after university presses to publish stuff and maybe more time writing for Christianity Today or whoever to make sure that there's that information that's out and usable to the larger church. That should count as much toward a promotion review or towards a hiring as the traditional pieces that go into the academic work, because that shows that this person is actually engaged and values evangelism as a practice. Second, I think that we should use all of our public presentation opportunities to put evangelism forward. And what I mean by that is this. Since most of us are multidisciplinary, when we get up to give a presentation at our schools, when we're giving our sabbatical lectures or we're giving some other kind of public address, we have an option whether we're going to talk about evangelism or we're going to talk about something else. And we all have these other fields that we may even have PhDs in. My PhD is in history, that we can talk about instead. And what I'd like to suggest is we make certain when we have the opportunity to speak to the larger academy, to our schools, to whoever it is, that we use that opportunity to explain evangelism so that there's a better awareness and understanding of what that looks like as a field of study, so that that larger group gets at least some inkling, breaks through a little bit of the sort of standard stereotypes and ignorance that still is pervasive there. So they won't just be valuing us as colleagues, they'll also be valuing what we teach as well. And we use our platforms to help make that happen. So given all that, the big deliverance for me out of this is simply to say thank you to the previous generations of AETE. My clear sense is that had AETE not existed, had we not had the last 33 years of the journal, had we not have had AETE as a whole here since 1973, the numbers wouldn't be as good as they are. I'm convinced that AETE was part of laying the foundation. And listening last night to the past presidents as they were speaking, and there are many others that could have been up here as well, we know. If you think about what they were talking about, so much of what they were discussing and what they developed is what we use as the basis for our scholarship today. The assumptions we have about how evangelism moves forward and how we've driven the scholarship forward. If it hadn't been for their work, we wouldn't have as positive or as solid a trajectory as we've got. And so my main takeaway from this was to give thanks that God saw fit to inspire that first group, Chuck Hunter and Dick Armstrong and all of those folks to lift this up, to create this, and to make a foundation for those of us who followed to be able to do the work that we do today and to have as much cachet as we do have in the academy. There's work to be done, to be sure yet, to have what we're doing accepted and understood more fully, but we're valued in ways that I don't think that first group was valued. And that's thanks to their being willing to be the initial pioneers to make this happen.